My parents didn't have money for school books either. In Malawi, the schools didn't provide learning materials like they do in America. Even in better times, most students couldn't afford to buy their own books and had to share. At Wimbe Primary, that meant squeezing your bottoms together in the same seat and hoping your friend didn't read faster than you. Luckily for me, Gilbert always had his own books and allowed me to look on. The two of us even read at the same level. As I mentioned, the conditions at Wimbe Primary had been terrible. Holes in the roof that let in the rain. No glass in the windows to stop the cold winter wind. Lessons held under trees. And of course, I told you the terrible stories about the latrines. I was hoping for a better environment at Kachokolo, but no such luck. When Gilbert and I arrived at our new classroom, our teacher, Mr. Tembo, instructed us to sit on the floor. The government sent no money for desks and chairs, he said, looking embarrassed, or anything else for that matter. Certainly not for repairs. In the center of the floor was a giant hole where it looked like a bomb had exploded. The walls were chipped and coming apart. A damp breeze blew through the broken windows, and sure enough, when I looked up at the ceiling, I saw a lot of blue sky. To my delight, Mr. Tembo was a kind, soft-spoken man who was patient about the setbacks. Like most teachers in community schools, he lived in a small house next door with his wife and children. His clothes were old and a bit ragged, and the small vegetable garden behind his house could hardly sustain his family. But unlike the farmers, he received a meager salary that allowed for some extra grain during the hunger. Even still, I'd seen his kids in the yard before school, and their arms and legs were as skinny as mine. Despite the poor conditions, Mr. Tembo wasted no time starting our lessons. Right away, we began studying history, covering early civilizations in China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. We learned about early forms of writing and how these cultures communicated with one another. I'd always had trouble in math, but I loved our discussions about angles and degrees and how to use a ruler to take measurements. I remember hearing those words from the builders in the trading center. One afternoon, we began our lessons in geography. Mr. Tembo pulled out a map of the world and asked us to find the continent of Africa, which was easy. Now, can anyone find Malawi? He asked. Yeah, here it is. We ran our fingers lovingly over our country. I couldn't believe how small it was compared to the rest of the world. To think, my whole life and everything in it had taken place on this little strip of earth. On the map, the land was green and the lake appeared like a blue jewel. It was hard to guess that 11 million people lived in that tiny space, and at that very moment, nearly all of us were slowly starving. That week, I realized I'd been wrong. The hunger was just as painful at school as it was at home. All day my stomach growled and gave my brain no peace, and soon it was too difficult to pay attention. At first, my classmates and I were eager to raise our hands and answer one of Mr. Tembo's questions. A few of us even competed to be the first one called. Kamkwamba here, over here, I'd shout. But after 2 weeks, a silence fell over the room each morning and never lifted. Faces became thinner, and since we had no soap or lotions at home, our skin gradually turned dry and gray, as if dusted in ash. During recess, a few of my friends simply walked off campus to search for food and never returned. None of this mattered anyway. On the first day of February, W.M. Feary made the following announcement at assembly. The administration is aware of the problems across the country, which we all face. But many of you still haven't paid your school fees for this term. Starting tomorrow, the free period is over. My worst fear had come true. I knew my father hadn't paid my fees. But who was I kidding? We were eating 1 meal per day. We couldn't afford to buy a bar of soap, much less pay 1,200 kwacha for my school. Walking home, I got mad at myself for even getting excited and coming in the first place. I'd allowed myself a glimpse of the dream, and now it was crumbling all around. What am I going to do? I asked Gilbert. I have no choice but to face the music. Don't stress, he said. Just go home and see what happens. When I arrived home, I found my father in the fields. At school, they're saying I should bring my fees tomorrow. 1,200 kwacha, I said. So we should pay them. Mr. Feary wasn't joking around. My father stared at the dirt for a long time, then said, You know our problems here, son. Right now, we have nothing to spare. I'm so sorry. The next morning, I stood by the road and waited for Gilbert. For some reason, I still wore my school uniform, but I wasn't going anyplace. When Gilbert appeared and waved, I let him walk past. "What's the matter?" he said, turning around. "Aren't you coming to school?" I wanted to cry. "I'm dropping out. My parents don't have the money." Gilbert looked upset, which somehow made me feel better. "So sorry, friend. Hopefully they can find it." "Yes, perhaps," I said. "See you later, Gilbert." I walked down to Jeffrey's house to give him the news. A few weeks before, he'd gotten lucky when a bolt of lightning knocked down a tree in his yard. He'd chopped it into bundles and sold it as firewood along the road. It was enough to keep his family eating for a while, or at least I thought so. Jeffrey was getting dressed when I entered his room, and the sight of him made me gasp. He'd lost so much weight. His eye sockets were sunken and dark, but the white parts of his eyes seemed to glow. This is what starving people look like, I thought. They look like ghosts. "Why aren't you in school?" he asked. "Didn't you get selected for Cachacolo?" "No money. Today I dropped." "Oh," he muttered, then went quiet. "Me and you were in the same desperate situation. I hope God has a plan for us." "Yeah," I said. "Me too." In the afternoon, I waited by the road to meet Gilbert as he walked home. When he saw me, he was shaking his head. "Almost everyone dropped out," he said. "Today we were few. Out of the 70 students, only 20 remained." Chapter 7.